Welcome. Thank you all for joining us for ArtBreak today. Before we begin, just a quick reminder that ArtBreak will be moving to Wednesdays in the new year. Same time, same place, but starting on January 15th, we will be meeting on Wednesdays rather than on Tuesdays. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jim Carter, who has long been an integral part of our community here at the KIA. In addition to being a generous donor whose support has helped to make our offerings more robust and accessible, Dr. Carter was a student here for decades, a member of the board of directors for 13 years, the board president for 2 years, and he is now in his 12th year of serving as a docent. And as a docent, his insights and his depth of knowledge have really been just absolutely invaluable. And I encourage you to come to our next gallery gathering, which will be on November 7th. Dr. Carter will be leading that gallery gathering along with Michelle Tracy. So I encourage you to come out to that. You can find more information on the side table about this gathering and a number of other events that we have coming up as well. So please plan to join us for that conversation. Dr. Carter joins us today to share a research project that he conducted on the history of the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts at the request of our curatorial team to be published as part of a forthcoming collections-based catalog. He spent 4.5 months on the project, copied or downloaded over 300 articles from the Kalamazoo Public Library and the Kalamazoo Gazette. He dug through letters, monographs, historical timelines, written and oral histories, remembrances, and program events from the KIA library and archives. The result was a 23-page single-space document of over 17,000 words. So we really look forward to sharing more information about the catalog with you when it becomes available. Jim, on behalf of the KIA, I'd like to thank you for your meticulous work on this project and for your invaluable contributions to this institution as a whole. Please join me in welcoming Jim Carter.
Thank you very much for coming in on this beautiful fall afternoon. As Mayor mentioned, there are a number of people that have preceded me, and one of the best histories that I read of the KA was by Greg Skowski in the back. So I use his history quite a bit, but I focused on the people and events of the KAA. So I want to introduce you to some of these people that influenced us. One of the early things about Kalamazoo is we've always been an art community. And this is a circa 1920 picture of the Palette and Chisel Club of Kalamazoo. There were two major organizations that were volunteers at the time. There was the Palette and Chisel Club, which did mostly art classes. And then there was the Art League, a little bit different than the Art League that you know, that was for exhibitions and lectures. So those were the two major volunteer organizations in the early 20th century. Now our story really begins in 1923. 1923, artists, local artists said, let's form a group and let's associate with the American Federation of the Arts. So in 23, they formed the Kalamazoo chapter of the American Federation of the Arts. Catherine Wood was probably the most well-known artist at the time. She was a Kalamazoo native. And she said, well, you know, it's nice to be part of this national organization, but we really should be a local organization. And so she worked with the American Federation Kalamazoo chapter and formed the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts, and our Constitution was adopted in 1924. In 1924, we had a rented room at the YWCA on the second floor. It was a new building at the time. We had our exhibitions in the lobby. Now, one of the first very important people in our story is Louise Raymond. Louise Raymond was a Kalamazoo native. She married a very wealthy Chicago wholesale hardware dealer. They had no children. Louise Raymond would famously rent a cab in downtown Chicago, come to Kalamazoo, spend the day in Kalamazoo. She'd often go to the bank, she'd get money, she would go to her favorite charities, one of which was YWCA, and give them cash. Then she would drive back that evening to Chicago in her cab. She and her husband had no children, and they had money to give. In 1925, she gave $200 to the KIA to start an operations fund, and she started an endowment fund over the next several years that grew to $20,000. So this is $20,000 in 1925. And we lived on that $20,000 for several decades. Well, the YWCA ultimately asked us to move out. So this is actually our first episode of being homeless, if you will. So we were told, we've got to vacate, and the Kalamazoo Board of Education had just received as a donation the Peck House, which is down the block from the YWCA. So this is a picture of the Peck House, 335 South Rose Street. And so we entered into an agreement, the KA entered into an agreement with the Board of Education of Kalamazoo to share some space with them. And the plan was that the Board of Education would keep the building up, and we would be able to work with the public library and with the public museum in this facility. So we went into the facility with an understanding and an agreement with the Board of Education, but clearly this was not the space we needed. So within 2 years, we were moving. Now, I show a picture of Flora Roberts. Flora Roberts was the library director. She was responsible only to the Board of Education of Kalamazoo. And she was in charge of the KA and the public library. And so her vision was that the KIA and the public library would merge together and be under her control. So that's how we kind of started our existence, if you will. Well, the Peck House was inadequate, so within 2 years, we were moving again, not necessarily homeless this time, but we were moving again to the house next door to the Peck House called the Coffer House. And the Coffer House was a bigger, better facility for us. The Upjohn Company spent $40,000 to buy the house. The Board of Education put in $20,000 for the purchase. So for $60,000, we had another new space. Now the plan was that the Public Museum, under the control of the Board of Education, would be on the first floor, and the KIA would be on the second floor, and our studios would be behind 2 galleries on the second floor in the, quote, attic. So we had studio space in the attic, and we had gallery space on the second floor. Now, if you look at the dates, you see 1930, and you know what was happening in 1930. From 1930 on, the Depression was occurring. By about 1933, 1934, the Depression really hit Kalamazoo. And so the support from the Board of Education pretty much diminished to nothing by 1933. Well, the Board of Education said to the KA and the Kalamazoo Public Museum, you all have to work it out, but Public Museum on the first floor, you're on the second floor KA. But the Public Museum wanted more space, so they kept putting their material, particularly the stuffed animals and birds, in storage on the second floor. So this euphemistically became the war of the stuffed animals and birds. And so there was kind of a tete-a-tete back and forth between the Public Museum and the KIA, and they would put their stuffed birds up on the second floor, would put their stuffed birds even below the first floor, and it went on and on. But this discord, if you will, lasted for several decades. Now, the Public Museum, the Board of Education had their champion in Flora Roberts. We had our champion in Blanche Hull. And Blanche Hull was really, I think, the person that got us going. She was a strong, determined woman. She was a Kalamazoo native. Her father was a banker. Her father died in a tornado in Minnesota when she was in elementary school. Her mother died when Blanche was in high school. Her guardian and cousin had them move in with them. So she and her sister moved into this house on the corner of South Street Park, which is now the Park Club. So Blanche Hull lived in the Park Club for a while. And then when she graduated from high school, she went to Smith College, and she became a social worker. After graduating from Smith College, she worked downtown New York City for a number of years. And then she worked for about 5 years over in Chicago in the famous Hull House, downtown Chicago, but not related to her family. Anyway, Blanche Hull believed very strongly that art was an essential expression of humanity and that the KI should be truly independent. Blanche Hull was described as extremely intelligent with excellent common sense, and a strong sense of purpose. I take that to be a very strong personality, and that's what we needed. So she and Flora Roberts kind of disagreed. Blanche Hull felt we had to be independent to do our mission. Flora Roberts felt that we should fold into the public museum. Well, Flora Roberts appointed a overseer for the public museum in the KIA, and that overseer was named Lois Cole. And I think because of the War of the Stuffed Animals and Birds, she only lasted a year, and she resigned in 1931. Blanche Hull, seeing that she had no supervisor, if you will, quickly got into her car, drove to Chicago, and went to the Art Institute of Chicago, where she met a young artist named Sylvester Jerry. She convinced Sylvester Jerry to be our first full-time director. At the time, his salary was $80 per month for an 8-month season. That was $6,400 a year. Now, there were some bennies. One of the benefits was that Louise Raymond was more than willing to help out. And so, as Jerry says in his memoirs, he said that Blanche Hull said, let's go to Chicago and let's meet Louise Raymond. And Sylvester Jerry said, well, sure. And so they get in Miss Hull's car, and Miss Hull said, well, you drive, because she didn't like to drive, evidently. So Jerry drove to Chicago. They met Miss Hull, Mrs. Raymond. After lunch, Mrs. Raymond put $500 on the table and said, go to Europe for the summer and study art, and just send me a postcard from Paris. And that's what he did. He said it was the greatest summer of his life. So there was some bennies with being our full-time director, but Sylvester Jerry did it all. He did the teaching, he did the exhibitions, he did the cleaning, he fired the furnace, he did it all. Now, he and Ms. Hull wanted to have a little bit higher profile in the area, so they decided in 1934 to start a lecture series. And Ms. Hull and Sylvester Jerry felt that one of the most prominent artists was in Detroit, a guy named Diego Rivera. He was doing a mural at the DIA. And so they got in the car. Sylvester Jerry drove to Detroit. They met with Diego Rivera, and they agreed for $50 he would come to Kalamazoo and speak. Now, one of the people that kind of intertwines in our story is the Kalamazoo Gazette journalist, and his name was Philip White. And Philip White was a journalist, and he was a major advocate of the KIA. And he convinced the editor of the Kalamazoo Gazette to run a front page article about this famous artist coming to Kalamazoo to speak. So they ran this article the day before Diego Rivera was to speak. We had a sellout crowd at the relatively new Civic Auditorium. We charged 50 cents for non-members, members were free, and it was a huge success. Now, a couple of weeks after Diego Rivera was here, the Kalamazoo Gazette editor found out the baggage that Diego Rivera had, being a communist and some of his misbehavior. So he was pretty concerned that he had offered a front page story on Diego Rivera when he was probably not the great artist, but maybe not the best person in the world. But anyway, Diego Rivera spoke in French. We had an English translator, and if the translator didn't translate exactly the way he wanted him to translate, then he would break in and correct him in English and then go back to speaking in French. So that's how our first of many famous lectures began. Another very important person in our story is Catherine Hodgman, and we see her as on your left. And then she's in the center with her husband, Dr. Albert Hodgman, in this 1949 photograph. Catherine Hodgman was hired by Kalamazoo College in 1930 to start the art program at the Kalamazoo College. So she was on the faculty from 1930 to 1935. She was extremely well trained. Her MFA was from Wellesley College. She spent a year in Paris studying art. She was a really good artist. And she was a strong advocate of arts in the community. The Kalamazoo Gazette described her as bringing energy and enthusiasm to the arts in Kalamazoo. She was a strong supporter of Blanche Hull. She was a strong supporter of the KIA. She was on the board of directors for a number of years. And she was also taught classes for us at the KIA. Interestingly enough, in 1930, which is a little bit unusual, her husband, who was a Harvard graduate medical school, so medical school at Harvard, fully trained as a surgeon, our first fully trained surgeon in Kalamazoo, came to Kalamazoo, followed his wife for her first professional job. So both were pillars in our community for many, many decades. Anyway, Catherine Hodgman was an exceptional artist. She had many shows regionally, both individually and with others. This is an example in our collection on right. It's also in Legendary Voices across the way if you want to look at it. She was described as having an impressionistic touch with a fondness for portraits that portray feminine interests and feminine frills. So that was from the Kalamazoo Gazette. So she was a very important person in our story early on. Another important person in our story early on is a guy named George Rickey. You see him on the left doing a mural at Olivet College. George Rickey was one of the earliest artists in the country to receive a Carnegie Foundation Artist in Residency program. So the Artist in Residency program from Carnegie Foundation, they felt that people could learn art in the community by watching somebody do art. And so oftentimes at universities, they would pay for somebody like Rickey to come and do a mural, and the audience would come and they would ask him questions as he's doing his thing. Now, Rickey was an exceptional artist in terms of a figurative artist, and this is an example, and again, in our collection on the right, called The Card Player's Oil on Canvas by Rickey. So Rickey was in Olivet College. Catherine Hodgman needed somebody to cover her classes at K College when she went on maternity leave, so she went over and talked to Rickey. And Rickey said, yeah, I'll come over. I'll teach part-time at the KIA and finish my Carnegie Foundation Fellowship at Olivet College. So in 1938, he comes over, gets to know Kalamazoo, gets to know K College, taught a few classes at K College, while Catherine Hodgman was on maternity leave. He finishes a Carnegie Fellowship Foundation Fellowship in 1939. He wanted to stay in Michigan, so he rented a cottage at Fenville, in Fenville, Michigan. And so he, at the time, to earn a little bit of money, taught half-time at K College and half-time at the KIA. So he was really an instructor at the KIA in 1939, 1940. Now, we know Rickey best for his ceramic, or for his stainless steel kinetic work. In fact, this is also in Legendary Voices across the way. So George Rickey was probably the most famous artist at the time that came to Kalamazoo. In the summers, when he was off, he spent his summers in New York City. In New York City, he met a German immigrant named Ufert Wilke. So Ufert Wilke is another important person in our story. Wilke was an artist. He was a German citizen. He had a fellowship at Harvard. He was spending the summer in New York City. Wilke and Rickey really got along very, very well. And when the opening for the KA came open in 1939, he felt that Wilke would be an ideal director. He convinced the board of directors of the KA to hire Wilke as our new director. So Wilke was going to start in 1939, October 39, at the KA as our director. His main instructor was going to be George Rickey. They decided to go to Mexico before Wilke started. So in August, they drove down to Mexico. They were in Mexico in September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. So Wilke is a German citizen. He is on a student visa, and he knows what's coming. He does not want to go back to Germany. So he leaves Rickey in Mexico, gets back to Kalamazoo as fast as he can, starts working as a director, thinking, well, this will be a path to citizenship. Well, by January of 1940, he realized that's not going to be the case. And so he has to leave the country and come back in on a citizenship pathway. So he leaves Kalamazoo, goes to Cuba to come back in on a citizenship pathway. So KA is without a director, but we have this guy working as a part-time instructor named George Rickey. So George Rickey then becomes our part-time interim director in 1940 until Wilke can come back on the citizenship pathway, which he does. Now, Wilke was an extremely well-trained artist in his own right. He was also an excellent art historian. He had connections all over the world. His father ran a magazine like a New Yorker magazine in Germany. And so Wilkie was just connected really all over the country. One of the things that he did was bring in exhibitions. And one of the most famous exhibitions, at least of our early history, was a history of the Dutch masters of the 17th century. And I showed this, the key piece of this exhibition was this Rembrandt, portrait patron oil on panel in 1635. So that was one of 50 pieces that were going to be in Kalamazoo. And we had Franz Halls, we had Rysdale, we had Rembrandts, we had Wilkie got them all. Now, I show this about patron buys because art in Europe was often sent over to America or North America to kind of hide or protect. So this portrait by Rembrandt was in Montreal. And so Montreal, before our show opened the 1st of March, sent it to Detroit. Detroit sent it on to Kalamazoo. Kalamazoo had no idea what to do with it. They sent it back to Detroit. Detroit sent it back to Montreal. And this circus went on for a while, went on for several weeks. So here you had this priceless portrait just bouncing around between shipping stations. Finally, Montreal says, no, it's supposed to be in Kalamazoo at the KIA. So it finally arrives March 13th, 1942. So, it was a $100,000 portrait at the time. It's probably $25, $30 million now, just kind of bouncing around between different shipping offices. Anyway, this was one of the key pieces for this exhibition. So Wilkie really ramped up our programs. Now, the other major artist that I want to talk about that was probably at the time more famous than Ricky or Wilkie was Philip Evergood. And this is a portrait on the left of Philip Evergood in front of a mural. And that mural still is in place in Kalamazoo College. It's called the Bridge of Life. And this is why, while Evergood was painting this mural, he was also a Carnegie Foundation artist in residence. So like Ricky, he was also an artist in residence. So for 2 years, all he had to do was paint this mural on Kalamazoo campuses, in Wells Hall on Kalamazoo campus. So for the academic years 41-42, he was painting, but also became a part-time instructor at the KIA. There's no doubt that Catherine Hodgman encouraged him to fully immerse himself into Kalamazoo. So he was doing shows, he was teaching classes, he was doing his Carnegie Foundation Fellowship. And one of the lectures that he gave was called The Role of Art in the Time of War. 1942 was when it was given. And Catherine Hodgman stated that was the finest lecture she had ever heard in her life. And this was in her memoirs dated when she was in her 70s. So Philip Evergood was one of our most famous artists at the time. Now, during the 30s and early 40s, we were receiving eviction notices from the Board of Education. So we were in the Coffer House. And again, the Public Museum was on the first floor, we're on the second floor with a small studio in the back. And the Board of Education wanted us out. And so for over 13 years, we received eviction notices. And most of the time they were kind of ignored. This is a letter from the Board of Directors, Dr. McLeod. This was 1942 was the date of this letter. Anyway, he addresses it to the community. He says, "Dear friend, eviction is a chilling word." And then he goes on to explain how valuable the KIA is to the community and how unfair it is that we are being evicted. In 1945, we did not receive an eviction notice. We received a vacate notice with all their lawyer signatures. So we said, oh, this is real. And so in 1945, we had 1 year to vacate the Coffer House, and we did. So this is the second time now we are homeless, if you will. Now, we had a director at the time. Her name was Marion Dickinson. You see her on the very far left of this picture. Marion Dickinson was a KPS teacher. She trained at Western Michigan. She herself was an excellent artist. And when we received our vacate notice, well, the KIA vacated to her living room. So in fact, she ran the KIA out of her living room for a year. She arranged to have classes in different places around the community. In 1947, after doing this for 3.5 years, she actually moved to LA and worked in Beverly Hills. But this was not a vacant, this was during this time, the board of directors was trying to find us a place. And they found a place. And this was the American Legion home. And it was at the corner of South Park and South Street, right where we are right now. So we bought the American Legion home in the spring of 1946. It's been a year to remodel it. Now, we had no money. We had no money. We had an endowment of $20,000 from Anne and Louise Raymond. And that's all we had. And that's what we were living on. We were able to raise $5,000. We were able to convince the American Legion Post, who owned the building, that, yep, $25,000 was good enough for this building. And then we were able to convince Kalamazoo Foundation and the WWCA estate that if they kicked in $20,000 for a remodel, we were up and going. We were free and clear. We owned a building. We owned land. And then we had a fundraiser that did raise enough money for operations for the year. So our new space had 3 galleries, and we had 2 studios. And that's what we had in the old American Legion home. This was basically, again, built as a home, wood frame, having all these priceless exhibition pieces in the wood frame. Well, one of the unique things about the KIA is we have an art school. And our first class was actually in Kalamazoo Central, taught by Nina Bell Ward. Nina Bell Ward we have in our collection. She is one of our, again, famous Kalamazoo artists, extremely well-trained Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. She had exhibitions in Philadelphia. So she was really a marvelous artist. She taught our first classes. When we moved to the Coffer House, we pulled in the adult classes. So we started doing adult classes. By 1931, we had Sylvester Jerry, who was an excellent artist. He was also one of our teachers. In 1932, the Palette and Chisel Club joined the KIA. And that's important because the Palette and Chisel Club was really, the credibility, if you will, the student credibility for the KIA. So they joined us in 32. And then by 1936, we were having visiting professors, which continued pretty much throughout our history. So in 1947, we had a director after Marion Dickinson left, named Philip Merrill, and he was from the East Coast. His wife accompanied him. She was a commercial artist, a fashion designer, and a fashion illustrator in New York City. So she was an extremely well-trained artist, as was he. They seemed to be happy in Kalamazoo, but they applied for a fellowship from Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts called the Creation Scholarship that paid for both of them to go to Europe for the entire year. So paid for everything for a year in Europe. So Philip Merrill left. Well, the chairman of the executive committee of the KIA was Genevieve Gilmore. And she said, but we've been kind of having this rapid turnover of directors. Why don't we affiliate with something fairly stable? So we affiliated with the University of Michigan. So the University of Michigan took over the school, but they also helped with exhibitions. They helped with shows. And we were affiliated with the extension services of the University of Michigan from 1949 to 1955. Now, the great thing about the University of Michigan affiliation is they would have an artist in residence. An artist live in their communities, in this case Kalamazoo, and kind of be the person in charge. And the person in charge for us was none other than Kurt Newman. So he was our artist in residence from the University of Michigan through the extension services. He used Paul Haller-Jones, Gerald Mask as art instructors from Grand Rapids. And then Gibson Beard joined us in 1952 as an interim director. So this is how Kurt came to Kalamazoo. So the school is going well under Kurt's leadership. We're having good exhibitions, but it was felt that we needed a little bit higher profile in our own community. So again, our friend Philip White, who was Kalamazoo Gazette journalist, met with our board chairman at the time over coffee in 1951 and said, hey, why don't we do a show, an exhibition downtown? Why don't we take over the park? And let's call this the Clothesline Art Show. And so the first Clothesline Art Show was June 1952. And this is a picture, actually, this is a picture of 1960, this photograph. But the plan was to engage the ordinary person in the world of art. That's what Philip White wrote in his article preceding the Clothesline Art Fair. So artists actually literally hung their art between the trees on clothesline. The whole intent was that this would be more demonstration. So all of our faculty members were doing demonstrations. Kurt Newman was down doing ceramics, and we had our painters doing watercolor, and we had stuff for the kids. And it was themed, and actually the Clothesline Art Show was themed for a number of years. First theme was West Bank of Paris. So we were, Gay Paris, if you will. And it was really popular. We drew over 20,000 people downtown to Kalamazoo. The superintendent of parks, a gentleman named Nicholas Kick, said it was the finest use of the park he'd ever seen. So this was the first of our Clothesline Art Show. We are still the second oldest continuous art fair in the United States. So this stimulated the interest in the arts. And led by the Kalamazoo Foundation, whose board chairman was none other than Donald S. Gilmore. So Donald S. Gilmore was the board chairman of the foundation. And the foundation said, well, we really need to build a cultural center. And so they hired an architect. They hired this famous architect from Sweden. And the architect said, well, let's build a building. Let's do it off West Main. So if you're going up West Main, you're heading west on West Main, there's a cemetery on the right. And on the left, there's a little triangular piece of property that's Grand Avenue. So it's at the corner of Grand Avenue and West Main. And they proposed that this art center would be built on that property and would overlook the community. So it overlooked Kalamazoo. And the foundation was willing to pop $1 million for this. And it was going to be shared by Kalamazoo College and the Western and the KA. Well, I think the board, at least the KA, was a little bit skeptical. We've been in relationships before that didn't necessarily work out. So ultimately the deal was scrapped. But there was interest in having an art center, a new art center. We had to get out of this old house, if you will, this wooden frame house. So Donald Gilmore is the president of the foundation. Genevieve Gilmore is our president of the executive committee of the board of Kalamazoo board. Both Donald and Genevieve were excellent artists in their own right. Genevieve was very proficient in photography, printing, and painting. And in fact, on the left is one of her paintings that's in our permanent gallery. Mr. Gilmore was very proficient in silversmithing and jewelry making and took private lessons from Kurt Newman for a number of years. So I think between Donald and Genevieve, they decided, well, we really need to be downtown. We need to be in the cultural hub of Kalamazoo, which is in fact Bronson Park. So we had property that we owned here, pretty much underneath us. The Kalamazoo Foundation and the Gilmore, the Upjohn Company, owned the property around our building, around the old American Legion. So they said, well, we'll give you this property if somebody will pay to build the building. Well, Genevieve and Donald S. Gilmore said, we'll pay for it. We'll pay for the building. We'll put up $1 million for this building. We'll also get the expertise we need to make this go. One of the key pieces they brought in was a new director named Alfred Maurice. Alfred Maurice was the executive director of the Maryland Institute of Art, and that was the oldest school in the U.S. Maurice was thrilled to help design a building that would have a gallery space next to a school. He felt those two fit together like a hand and a glove. So this is a picture of Maurice in our temporary facility. So we owned this property around the American Legion building. We owned our American Legion building property. So we had to tear all that down. In the process, we had to have a temporary location, and that was at the Free Methodist Church on the corner of Jane Street and Jasper Street. So that's where this photograph was taken, in our temporary facility. And again, in all these times that we were displaced or moving around, all things continued. So classes continued, exhibitions continued, everything continued while we were going through this transition. So in 1961, we were able to open our new facility. Just as a quick reminder, the main doors are opening onto Park Street. So that's why our address is Park Street, even though we're on South Street. It's always been, there's always kind of a wonder, why is our address, Park Street? But that was our initial opening. So the Kalamazoo Foundation also came up with operational money for us. They set up a $500,000 endowment with Upjohn stock in 1958. So we had money for operation. We had gifts of land, gifts of the property all around our building, and we owned our building free and clear. So we were able to use this land, build this new structure for $1 million. So we used Skidmore, Owens & Merrill was our design, our architecture design. Bruce Graham was our lead architect. Bruce Graham designed the Hancock Building in Chicago and the Sears Tower. So he was a biggie. Opening night, we had over 3,000 people attend opening night. Our membership drive in 1961 was phenomenal. We doubled our memberships in 1 year because of the new construction. We had help from people, cartoonist named Al Capp, who did Lil Abner, if you remember Lil Abner. Al Capp helped us with our membership drive, so we have 5,000 members, which is phenomenal for us. We also had a capital campaign going on at the same time, and we exceeded our capital campaign by over $15,000. Grand opening was over 3,000 people. The Kalamazoo Symphony had an ensemble that played continuously throughout the afternoon and evening. The Kalamazoo Gazette was absolutely effusive in the praise of this new structure. The beauty of the structure was it was glass, it was open, and it was said by Bruce Graham, who trained under a very famous architect named Miles Andrew, that art is for the enjoyment of people, it's not for the interment of art. So he didn't want art in closed spaces, he wanted art in galleries where we have windows, which we still have. So throughout all this, the art school is still going. And so in 1961, we added classes. We had classes in sculpture, we had classes in jewelry weaving and photography, and we still have photography classes, photography program with a darkroom, which is unusual now. If you're studying photography, it's all digital. You go to all these art institutions and everything's digital. We still have our darkroom. We started in 61 with our summer art camps. The visiting professor workshops remained extremely popular, and we brought in artists from truly all over the country in all disciplines. In 1965, Maurice left. Maurice, who was our director at the time, left, went to the University of Illinois as the chairman of the Department of Art, job he really couldn't turn down. So again, we were kind of without a director, but the school was going so well, we decided to split the job. So we're going to have a director of school and then a director of acquisitions and exhibitions. So our director of school is Kurt Newman, who started with us in 1949. He did it all over his career, and Kurt's in the center of this photograph. And our director of exhibitions and acquisitions was Harry Griever. Harry Griever was a professor of art at the University of Maine. He widely exhibited in the US, he widely exhibited in Canada. He did a workshop in Copenhagen, Denmark, where he met his wife. She came back. She was also an excellent artist. On your right, you can see a lithograph by Harry Griever. On your left, you can see one of Henny's watercolors. They were with us for 11 years. They left in 1977 to follow their dream of opening up a studio and a gallery space on the ocean, and they picked the Pacific Ocean and specifically Cannon Beach in Oregon. So they left to pursue their dream. But during Griever's tenure, he increased our acquisitions, our permanent collections substantially. He called it later in his memoirs, he said that this was the golden age of acquisitions, and we increased our what we owned in our permanent collection enormously. During his tenure at the 5th anniversary of opening the Arts Center, it was renamed to the Genevieve and Donald Gilmore Arts Center. And this is really important. I mean, these people did it all. So the KA was extremely fortunate to be the recipient of their time, talent, and efforts. And this is a picture of them at the opening of the show, opening of the season. Griever was also our director when we had our 50th anniversary in 1974. And to celebrate our anniversary, our 50th anniversary, we wanted something special. Dorothy Upjohn Dalton said, well, you know, I will commission Kurt Newman to do a bronze. And so this is the bronze. It was a year and a half in the making. 6 men, 6 women. They've been described as comic, ample, ridiculous, gangly, absurd, lumpy, buxomly, and perhaps even political. Now, Newman would say, yeah, these kind of represent some people I knew in Kalamazoo. No, I'll never tell you who they are. So this is People, which is still out in front, and I think actually one of our centerpieces of our collection. Well, Griever left, as I mentioned, to go to Oregon, to the Pacific Coast. And we brought in a very good administrator named Tom Kaiser. Kaiser was the assistant director of the Flint Institute of Art. He recognized, he knew Kalamazoo, he realized that we were a sleeping giant. He arrived in 77. One of his early tasks was to start doing some exhibitions. He recognized talent, and like any good administrator, he recognized really good talent, and that was in Helen Sheridan. So Helen was at the time an assistant librarian, became a librarian, and then ultimately became a curator. And Helen is very important in our story as we bridge several different directors. But Helen's first task that Kaiser gave her was to organize an exhibition. And the exhibition was called German Expressionism Art. And these are 5 pieces from our collection that were also in the exhibition. And so this is German Expressionism. We ended up, she put together a show of 66 pieces. Local curators, local museum directors came, saw the exhibition, were just overwhelmed by it. And so they convinced us to talk to the Detroit Institute of Art to make this a traveling show. So for 1 year, this show traveled regionally, curated by Helen and with Tom's Kaiser's help. This really put us on the map. So no longer were we just a small regional institution. Kalamazoo had something that other museums wanted. So when I think of 3 things about Kaiser, I think of innovation. A couple of the things in terms of innovation. He started ArtReach, and ArtReach toured exhibitions that we put together to a wide range of people, to elementary schools, to nursing homes, to medical facilities, to just a wide range throughout Michigan. He started Artist Tours, and Artist Tours was a program where all 5th graders in the local schools, all 5th graders, had the opportunity to come to Kalamazoo, to the KIA, spend a half a day in the galleries and then doing an art lab project. So all students had this opportunity. It was awarded in 1987. It received the Michigan Educational Award for its originality and its content. He began the docent program in '82. Under his leadership, the school enrollment doubled, membership doubled. He got over $1 million in grants. Our budget went from $360,000 to $1.2 million, and he increased our corporate benefits by 4-fold. So he really did awaken a sleeping giant. Now we had an interim, and the interim was Ward Nade, and Ward was a retired vice president of engineering at the Upjohn Company. And Ward was on the board of directors of the KIA, and he chaired a committee looking at expanding the KIA because our visitors in 1961 in the galleries were a little bit less than 5,000 in 61. By 91, visitors in the gallery were over 60,000. So we really increased our gallery attendance. School enrollment was going through the roof. Our collections, what we owned in 1961 was 217 pieces of art. 217, that's all we owned. By 1990, it was 2,600. So he was very valuable in that interim time. Helen Sheridan was quoted in the newspaper as saying, Ward Nade stepped in, became a stabilizing influence for the KIA. So Ward Nade was important. And then we come to my friend, Jim Bridenstine. And Jim was our longest serving director from 1990 to 2014. And again, I think of three things when I think of Jim. I think of expansion, I think of exhibitions, and I think of acquisitions. In terms of acquisitions, Jim brought in approximately 1,700 pieces into our collection. And not only did he bring in pieces, but these were valuable pieces. These filled holes in our collection. He sought diversity. We have some fantastic pieces in our permanent collection. They're always on display, like the Tanner, like just on and on. But the acquisitions were really important that he brought in. But expansion was on the mind when Jim came. And as I mentioned, Ward Nade was chairing a committee on expansion. And so with expansion, Jim organized a capital campaign. It was called The Power of Art. And it was chaired by Bill Parfett, but Jim was the director and then actively helping Bill run it. Originally, it was for $12 million. It ended up being $14.9 million. And in addition to the building, it had an endowment for operations and collections. So on your right, we see the frame of the vestibule right out there. To give you a sense of size, notice the worker in the far right, up on the right. I'll give you an idea of the size. So our vestibule with the vaulted ceiling is, 32 to 35 feet in the air. So construction began in 1997. We were fortunate that a building right across the street on South Street was available, an old lawyer's building. It's where our parking lot is now. So we were able to buy the parking lot, get that building, and we moved over to the KIA Annex. And so the Annex was in that building. We had our offices there. There were 2 galleries in the Annex, but no school space. So our brand new director of school, Denise Lisicki, found school space throughout the county, in Parchment, and in Comstock, and in Portage, and in Kalamazoo, and in schools, and in Red Cross, and in senior centers. I mean, we had classes everywhere that she did. So we continued our full operations during the construction. Grand opening was 1998, and we went from 44,000 square feet to 72,000 square feet. And importantly, we added space for our collection, because our collection was growing. And any collection, ours, doesn't matter who it is, you have to have it under ideal conditions. Temperature has to be controlled, humidity has to be controlled, you have to have fire retardant. So we had to do all that infrastructure as part of our new construction. And then we built this auditorium. It was a community auditorium. We had a small auditorium in the lower level in the old building, but we built this. We had the interactive gallery. The photograph on your lower right, I think I'm flipping left and right for you folks. Sorry about that. On your lower right, from right to left, is Ron Boothby, who is director of facilities, Jim Bridenstine, and then our construction foreman. So I'm going to tell you a little story, and Jim's going to correct me after the talk. But Jim and I have talked about how we got to Chihuly several times, and I'm going to tell the story my way with a little bit of embellishment. But anyway, we had this vestibule. We had this beautiful opening, 32 to 35 feet in the air, depending upon who you look at. And in Jim's mind, it was ideal space for a Chihuly chandelier. And so construction is going on. He calls Chihuly Studios in Seattle, Washington, and said, I'm Mr. Bridenstine, I'm adding on to my building. I have a perfect place for a chandelier. And I want the chandelier to be 8 feet by 8 feet by 7 feet. And I want these colors. I want sunset colors. I want oranges. I want yellows. I want it bright. This is going to be the key piece of the opening of my gallery. So he goes through all the description, and he can hear them taking notes in Seattle. And finally he says, and how much is this going to be? I have a very generous donor, and and they give him a price, and he's crestfallen. There's no way. There is no way we can afford this. So he says, well, thank you very much, and kind of sheepishly hangs up, and knowing this is done. But Jim's talking to a friend in Washington, and he's kind of lamenting the fact that we can't get this beautiful Chihuly. And the friend, he didn't know at the time, the friend was a very good friend of Dale Chihuly. So this friend calls Dale Chihuly. He says, look, why don't you help out Kalamazoo? I mean, they got a perfect place for a chandelier, and, it would be ideal. And so Chihuly calls the workshop and says, tell me about it. He hears about it and says, call Bridenstine back. So out of clear blue, Mr. Bridenstine gets a phone call from Chihuly Studios in Seattle, Washington. I said, Mr. Bridenstine, let's go over these plans again. You want 8 feet by 8 feet by 7 foot. You want 464 pieces of individual glass. You want to look orange and yellow and reds. And okay. And then they say, now, Mr. Bridenstine, how much money do you have? And he kind of sheepishly says what he had. They, done deal. Mr. Chihuly says it's done. So we have our Chihuly. So it was installed in 1998. It weighs over 1,000 pieces, and it is 8 by 8 by 7. So that brings me to exhibitions. And we have had some phenomenal exhibitions. Again, when I think of the big three of Jim, I think of exhibitions. I think of all the great shows we've had. Chihuly is the one that everybody talks about. I talk about Spirit from the Storm, but and I talk about A Taste of Splendor, but this was what everybody in the community remembers. So this was a show 3 years in the making. It was specifically designed for Kalamazoo. Chihuly obviously knew about us because he basically gave away a chandelier. We were the only Chihuly show in North America. You came to the lobby, you were treated to a tower of glass. There were hundreds of brightly colored objects throughout the facility. We had our boat of glass, which is a hallmark of Chihuly, having a boat filled with glass. We had a Parisian ceiling. Chihuly never goes to his shows, never. But he came to Kalamazoo. And this was a picture of the line for the Chihuly book signing. It's stretched all the way around to Park Street. For the Chihuly show, we have 58,673 visitors. Never come close to that for one show. It was estimated that we increased the economic impact by $5.2 million in Kalamazoo. For the show, I wanted to show a picture of Chihuly. On your left, Susan Van Arendonk was our curator at the time, and Jim on the right in the upper photograph. One of the exercises that we did with the students, the young kids, is they would draw on paper a chandelier or some glass that they wanted Mr. Chihuly to do. And here we have a young, looks like a first or second grader, correcting Mr. Chihuly on how to do the glass. So that was one of our programs. And then on your left, we have a couple Kalamazoo citizens, Sandy Lipsy and Bob Alsman, looking at the Parisian ceiling in our collection. So docents led 173 tours. They had 6,000 students that toured the show. It was described in the Cherry Free Press as a visually, emotional, and physical experience. That was Chihuly. But we have some other things. And this is kind of my shout out to the curators who do a phenomenal job kind of behind the scenes. One of the early shows I remember coming down to was The Car is Art. This was curated by Susan Van Arendonk in 2007, where we brought in vehicles from the Gilmore Center. And I remember walking through it and thinking, man, how did they get that through the door? It turns out Ron Boothby had to take the door frame apart to get the cars in, but they did. On the upper right is a show curated by Denise Lisicki, who was the director of the school, Figure Revealed Contemporary Figurative Drawing. And this was a who's who of everybody in figurative drawing. It was in Kalamazoo, curated by locally. A curator's exhibition done by Craig Wiskowski, honoring Helen Sheridan. And this was homage to Helen and her collective taste, honor to the local artists that she supported, that she got into various shows. So this was also a very popular show. So in the 45 years, we've had great directors of exhibitions and collections, starting with Helen and continuing through to Rahima. They average now about 12, 14 shows per year. And if you figure the average show is maybe 90 pieces that go up and down, so they are handling thousands of pieces of priceless art every year, putting these shows on. And it's done mostly local. We probably only have several traveling shows, well, maybe 3 to 4 traveling shows per year. All the rest is local. So the art school is extremely important. Didn't want to have that as a second-class citizen, if you will. In 1997, Denise was our first female director. She was also the director during construction. She was the one that got classes all over the county. As soon as we opened up in 98, she started adding new classes, and I think one of the thoughts I have about Denise is her innovation with new classes, including digital media, art appreciation classes, classes for homeschools, which is really big, bringing in kids that are being homeschooled. She started trips, every other year trips to Italy or France. And then in 2010, we expanded to beyond art classes to include things like design and writing and wellness, meditation. Languages are a new class, and not just the classic languages, but we have a class in American Sign Language, which I think is really cool. There's very few people other than Western that would do a class like that. She started the post-baccalaureate program, which is a program for 7 to 10 students per year that have graduated with a BFA that want to spend a year working on their portfolio. So if we look at enrollment and our success, we go from 484 students in 61 to we're well over 3,400 students now. Last couple of years are from our annual report. We renamed the art school to honor Kurt Newman. On your left is the 2006 art school renaming. We see Kurt Newman with his wife Georgia. And then on the right, it was renamed in 2015, or rededicated, not renamed, rededicated. Both of these were because of very generous donations from the Browns. In the past month and a half, we just received a very generous donation from the Newman family for the art school. But on your right, we see on the tape, we see Mr. and Mrs. Brown, Kurt, and then Denise Lisicki. I think Jim said it best in 2006. He said, Kurt Newman created programs in multiple disciplines that encourage the average student to experience the joy of making art. The joy of making art. Well, starting a new gallery, naming a new gallery is really a big deal. It's a big deal. And in 2010, September 2010, we were able to open the Joy Light Gallery of Asian Art. And we see a picture on your left of Dr. Tim Light, Joy Light, and Vicki Wright. Vicki was with Jim and brokered this gallery, if you will. Vicki wrote in the Kalamazoo Gazette that this gallery is a gift from longtime KA supporter Tim Light in honor of his wife, Joy. She goes on to say, this gift enables us to represent the diversity of cultures here in Kalamazoo and the diversity around the world. In addition to opening the gallery, they have made funds available for exhibitions. They've made funds available for purchase of art, Asian art, and they have offered to donate up to 144 pieces from their own collection into our collection. So one of the shows that I've always enjoyed, or I enjoyed early on in the Joy Light Gallery, was Women Warriors, Portraits by Hung Lu. And that's the photograph on your left. That's also in our permanent collection. It's also downstairs, and it's one that I always use in a docent tour for a variety of reasons. But so they provide money for exhibitions. They provide money for acquisitions. The thing about Joy Light Gallery is it also includes some non-traditional Asian art. And Reaching to Infinity was a show Julian on. If you remember, you went into a darkened gallery and there's these lights, and you started looking into the lights, and it goes on to infinity. And in the back part of the gallery, it was on the floor. you start walking towards the front and go, oh, particularly if you're afraid of heights, you go, whoa, it looks like it's going forever. So the Joylight Gallery is big and important for us. Well, acquisitions are also important for any museum. This is from Sightlines. Most acquisitions are from gifts by private collectors or private donors. And we have, again, great gifts. I think of the pre-Columbian gold display that we have downstairs. I think of the oceanic art downstairs. I think of the Tiffany glass collection that we have given by a very generous donor and the Tiffany Company. Other donors establish funds for us to purchase art, to fill in pieces in our collection. But the biggest gift, and one that really we have to acknowledge, was the bequest from Mrs. Gilmore. And this was brokered by Tom Casers and Helen Sheridan. They worked with Mrs. Gilmore. And this is her bequest at her passing. And she leave 124 pieces to the KIA. These are three of my favorite pieces. On your left is the Degas, on the center is Cassatt, and on the right is Matisse. Mrs. Gilmore's daughter, Martha Parfait, said that if you look at the donation the KA is getting, if you look at it, you'll see it's mostly women. Women with pretty hats or women doing things. Given the opportunity between a landscape and a portrait of a woman, she will take a woman every day. So this is a part of the collection. And this collection also includes some Rembrandts and some other, it's just amazing what we received. Helen Sheridan quoted at the time of the donation, "These works were a final investment by Mrs. Gilmore in the cultural heritage of the city that she loved." So, the Gilmores have been phenomenal. Well, Belinda Tate has succeeded Jim for 9 years. And I think of three things, again, I can only think of three things at a time, given my age. So everything I remember, I actually used to teach medical students that remember three things and you can branch out. So I think of Belinda Tate, I think of the diversification of the collection. She managed COVID and she had great exhibitions. COVID was kind of big during her tenure. If you think about it, in her 9 years, nearly a quarter of the time was either COVID lockdown or COVID restriction. And we managed it well. Most museums our size never made it. Many businesses our size didn't make it. She was able to bring in $1 million in grants from organizations we've never had grants from before. She was able to electrify the museum, if you will. So we have virtual tours, we have virtual classes. This is being taped and is going virtually to, Miriam tells me, up to 120 people who regularly will tune into ArtBreak. She diversified the collection. She added about 10% to our total collection, but of that 10%, 46% were women artists and 32% were artists of color. So that diversification was extremely important to us and really helped build on what Jim Bridenstine had started with our diversification. She diversified our exhibitions. She did a couple things. She reinstalled the permanent collection in this Unveiling American Genius. It was reinstalled thematically as opposed to chronologically. And that's a little bit unusual for our museum to do thematic permanent collection. But early in her tenure, she brought in she helped with a exhibition called Common Ground, African American Art from Flint, Kalamazoo, and Saginaw, or Flint, Kalamazoo, and Muskegon. So the three museums worked together to create a show called Common Ground, American Art. And it was a great show. I remember doing tours of that show. I loved it. She brought in other artists and other great shows, including Renee Stout and Keaton Walkenstick, and just a whole bunch, Todd Gray, a whole bunch of people. But the biggest show she did was Black Refractions, highlights from the Studio Museum of Harlem. And that was probably our biggest show. We had two other shows downstairs in the lower level. One called Black Artists Where We Stand in Southwest Michigan, that was curated by Denise Lisicki. And the other show was a Common Ground. I'll tell you that in a second. Okay, I'm not going to do that in a second. Anyway, it was from our own collection, curated by Raheem Barber. So the whole museum at one point in time was devoted to art from people of color. Now we have, welcome Michelle. Michelle is a Michigan native, University of Michigan graduate. Her master's degree is from the prestigious Baird Graduate Center in New York City. And Michelle clearly believes with all of us that art is for everyone, inspires, transforms, and fulfills. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to particularly acknowledge Greg and Susan and Jim and others that were directors, and Amy, that are directors, and Miriam of the KA. Thank you very much. I can take just a few questions, but I'm running late, so if you have to go, go. Lida.
I seem to recall that a Chihuly was blue. Is that correct? Am I making that up?
You mean our Chihuly?
Yes.
No.
It originally was blue and they changed it to this color.
No, it was always going to be sunset type colors, those warm colors, because we're such a warm place. And I didn't mention I'm sorry, there's so many things I couldn't mention, but Jim, after we put it up, Jim insisted that we have lights on it 24/7. So it would always serve as a beacon, almost like a lighthouse, if you will, for the arts in Kalamazoo. So that's why you'll notice that there's floodlights that surround the Chihuly. So, no, and it was installed, 7 years before the Chihuly exhibition. A lot of people think we bought it at the exhibition. No, we had it up by that time. Any other questions? Excellent history also done by Craig Wiskowski that I used, and I want to thank Rick for that. It was really well done. Thank you all very much.